A CEO's late-night decision to follow an employee home began with a simple request that tugged at something deep within him. It wasn't the kind of thing you'd expect to keep a CEO awake, but there it was, a note so unassuming, yet impossible to ignore. Sophia Carter, a line cook who had quietly become part of the company's backbone, had asked for permission to take home leftover meals after her shift. Nothing about the request seemed out of place on the surface, but as Michael Reynolds sat in his dimly lit office long after everyone else had left, those few words gnawed at him. It wasn't just the simplicity of the question, it was how she phrased it. There was no demand, no sense of entitlement, just a polite inquiry that carried an undertone he couldn't quite shake. Most employees would have casually mentioned it to their manager or grabbed what they needed without fuss. But not Sophia. She went through official channels, almost like she didn't want to overstep. And that's what caught Michael off guard. He pulled up her file, scanning the details. 24 years old, single, no emergency contacts listed. The lack of personal connection struck him as odd. Was she private, independent, or was there more beneath the surface? As he leaned back in his chair, his mind wandered. Maybe she was just being frugal, trying to stretch every dollar. After all, even well-paying jobs didn't always shield people from financial struggles. But something told him this wasn't just about saving money. Her tone suggested need, not greed, but necessity. The clock ticked closer to 11 p.m., when Sophia's shift ended. Before he could second-guess himself, Michael grabbed his coat, shut down his laptop, and headed toward the kitchen exit. He wasn't entirely sure why he felt compelled to follow her. Only that curiosity had taken hold of him in a way it hadn't in years. Perhaps it was guilt, or maybe it was simply the realization that despite running a multi-million-dollar company, he knew next to nothing about the lives of the people who kept it running. The cool night air hit him as he stepped outside. The parking lot was nearly deserted, save for a few stragglers finishing their shifts. Across the lot, he spotted Sophia exiting through the kitchen door. She moved with precision, wiping down counters and packing up equipment as if choreographed by muscle memory. A manager handed her a brown paper bag, and she accepted it with a quiet nod, tucking it carefully under her arm. Watching her, Michael noticed the exhaustion etched into her features, the damp strands of hair clinging to her forehead, the slight slump of her shoulders. Yet, she worked tirelessly, ensuring everything was perfect before leaving. Once done, she untied her apron, folded it neatly, and slung her backpack over one shoulder. Then, without hesitation, she stepped out into the night, heading toward the bus stop down the street. Michael hesitated, lingering near his car. What exactly was he hoping to find? He watched as she stood under a flickering streetlight, arms crossed, shifting impatiently from foot to foot. The bus was late. When it finally arrived, she boarded without looking up, disappearing inside. Michael climbed into his sedan, careful to keep his distance as he followed the bus. He told himself he was being ridiculous, that this wasn't his business. Yet, something deep inside urged him to continue. The ride stretched longer than he anticipated, each stop bringing them deeper into parts of the city he rarely visited. Streetlights grew sparse, storefronts gave way to boarded-up buildings, and the skyline faded behind them. The neighborhoods became increasingly desolate, chain-link fences surrounding empty lots, houses showing signs of neglect. Checking the time, Michael realized it was past midnight. Still, Sophia remained seated, staring out the window with a distant expression. Where was she going? Why did she live so far away? Questions swirled in his mind, but none prepared him for what came next. Finally, Sophia pulled the yellow cord to signal her stop. Michael hung back, parking at the far end of the street where shadows would conceal his car. She walked briskly, her steps deliberate, never slowing down or glancing over her shoulder. The neighborhood wasn't overtly dangerous, but it wasn't welcoming either, especially not in the dead of night. Then, she turned a corner and disappeared behind a row of parked cars. Michael exhaled sharply, gripping the steering wheel tighter than he realized. He hadn't even noticed he'd been holding his breath. Slowly, cautiously, he eased the car forward, careful not to draw attention. And then he saw it. Not an apartment building, not even a modest house. It was a trailer, a weathered, rusting trailer that looked like it might collapse under its own weight. Sophia approached the door, balancing the brown paper bag carefully as she fumbled with her keys. When she stepped inside, a dim light flickered on, casting long shadows against thin curtains. Michael froze, staring in stunned silence. This wasn't what he had expected. Not by a long shot. But what happened next made his stomach churn. He kept his distance, hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. His heartbeat remained steady, but something about this moment felt heavier than anything he'd experienced in years. Why was she living here? Sophia had worked for his company for over a year. Sure, she wasn't earning 6 figures, but it wasn't minimum wage either. She worked full-time, often pulling double shifts. That should have been enough for a small apartment, right? Yet here she was, stepping into a trailer that seemed barely livable, the kind of place people only ended up in when they had no other options. Leaning forward slightly, Michael squinted through the cracked window of his car. Inside, the weak glow from a single overhead bulb revealed a cramped, cluttered space. Stains marred the walls, the carpet was threadbare and worn down. There were no decorations, no signs of comfort, just survival. And then came movement. 3 small figures emerged from the shadows, children. They rushed toward Sophia, arms wrapping around her waist, their laughter filling the tiny room. For a brief moment, her exhaustion melted away, replaced by warmth as she hugged them back. Michael swallowed hard. These weren't her kids. They couldn't be. They were too young for that. Siblings, maybe. Then, an older woman shuffled into view. Her hair was streaked with gray, her shoulders hunched with age. A grandmother, perhaps. Sophia guided her gently to a chair, speaking softly as she rested a hand briefly on the woman's frail shoulder before turning back to the counter and unpacking the food. What happened next hit Michael like a punch to the gut. She divided the contents of the paper bag onto 4 plates, not 5. The children dug in immediately, eating quickly, almost hungrily, as if meals were unpredictable. The older woman ate slowly, her hands trembling as she lifted the fork to her lips. But Sophia didn't touch her plate. Instead, she sat there cutting her food into smaller pieces, rearranging it with her fork, pretending to eat while smiling and nodding whenever one of the kids spoke. Her sacrifice was unmistakable, and unbearable to watch. She wasn't eating. She was giving up her share to ensure they had enough. Michael's chest tightened, his jaw clenched. He thought about his own dinner earlier that evening, a perfectly plated steak at a high-end restaurant, a bill that likely cost more than Sophia earned in 2 days. He hadn't even finished it. And yet here she was, sitting in a dilapidated trailer after a grueling 16-hour shift, pretending to eat so her family wouldn't worry. The scene unfolded before him like a mirror reflecting everything wrong with the system he was part of. This wasn't just an employee struggling to make ends meet. This was a life built on sacrifice, resilience, and quiet desperation. But what Michael didn't know yet was that Sophia's story ran deeper, and darker, than he could have imagined. As he sat there, gripping the steering wheel until his fingers ached, the hum of the street faded into the background. The distant hum of traffic, the occasional bark of a dog, it all felt muted compared to the weight pressing down on him. Through the window, he watched Sophia laugh softly as the kids chattered between bites. Her tired eyes softened with affection, and though she tried to look happy, Michael could see the cracks beneath the surface. Something about her smile didn't reach her eyes. Michael noticed the subtle signs, the way Sophia rubbed her temples when she thought no one was looking, the way her shoulders sagged under the weight of exhaustion. These were the cracks in her carefully constructed facade, tiny glimpses into the truth she worked so hard to hide. And then it happened. The oldest child, a boy who couldn't have been more than 10 or 11, asked a question that made Michael's chest tighten even further. "Did you eat at work today?" For a split second, just a fraction of a moment, Sophia's expression shifted. It wasn't much, just the faintest flicker of hesitation, but it was enough. Enough for Michael to see the lie before she forced another tired smile and answered, "Yeah, I had something earlier." The boy stared at her, unconvinced, but didn't push. He simply nodded slowly and went back to his food. Michael felt sick. This wasn't just a one-time sacrifice. It was a pattern, a routine born out of necessity. She had likely been doing this for weeks, maybe months. Yet every morning, without fail, she got up, went to work, stayed late, and came home with just enough to ensure her family didn't go hungry, even if it meant she did. Leaning back in his seat, Michael exhaled sharply. This wasn't just unfair, it was unacceptable. And the worst part, he hadn't even noticed. Inside the trailer, Sophia stood, gathering the empty plates. The kids yawned tiredly, stretching as they shuffled toward a small sectioned-off area in the back. The grandmother moved slower, settling into what looked like an old recliner instead of a proper bed. Michael squinted, trying to make sense of the layout. The trailer was impossibly small, too small for 4 people to share comfortably. There was no extra space, no second bedroom. Then he saw it, a thin mattress tucked into the corner near the kitchen. Barely thicker than a cushion, it sat on the floor with a single blanket neatly folded at its edge. That was Sophia's bed, not a bedroom, not even a couch. Just a thin mattress on the cold, hard floor. After working double shifts, after standing for hours in front of a hot grill, after serving meals to strangers all day, this is where she laid her head at night. Michael had seen enough. He ran a business that prided itself on being family-oriented, sitting in meetings where executives talked about employee satisfaction and fair wages. Yet here was one of his hardest working employees, homeless, starving, sacrificing everything for her family, all while he sat in an office so large it had its own espresso machine and leather chairs worth more than this entire trailer. He thought about the company perks, bonuses, retreats, corporate dinners. He thought about the wasted food thrown away at the end of every shift. Food that could have fed people like Sophia. Closing his eyes, Michael took a deep breath, trying to steady himself against the rising anger in his chest. This wasn't right. For the first time in a long time, he realized that simply feeling bad about it wasn't enough. He had to do something, and he had to do it now. But Michael didn't go home that night. He couldn't. Instead, he sat in his car, staring at the trailer long after the lights inside flickered off. His mind raced. How had he missed this? How many other employees were just like Sophia, silently struggling, showing up to work with smiles while their stomachs were empty? He thought about the corporate budget, the salaries of his executives, the thousands of dollars spent on marketing campaigns each month. And then he thought about Sophia's mattress on the floor. His fingers tightened around the steering wheel. This wasn't a personal failure, it was a company failure. And he was at the top of it. For years, he had told himself his employees were well taken care of. He had read reports, approved payroll structures, signed off on policies. But he had never really looked. Tonight, he had looked. And now, he couldn't unsee it. Michael picked up his phone and scrolled through his contacts. Without hesitation, he pressed call. It rang twice before a groggy voice answered. "Sir, it's past midnight. Everything okay?" It was his head of operations, the same person responsible for overseeing the company's employee programs. "No," Michael said, his voice firm. "Everything is not okay." There was a pause on the other end. "What do you mean?" Michael glanced at the trailer one last time before turning the key in the ignition. "We need to fix this. All of it, first thing in the morning." He didn't wait for a response. He hung up because this wasn't a problem that could wait. The next morning, Michael walked into the office with a singular focus: change. By noon, policies were already being rewritten. Leftover food was no longer optional for employees, it would now be packaged and distributed daily to those who needed it. Wages were re-evaluated and adjusted, ensuring that no full-time employee would ever have to choose between paying rent and putting food on the table again. A new program was launched, offering emergency financial assistance to employees facing hardships. This wasn't just a tweak, it was a complete overhaul, driven by the haunting image of Sophia's thin mattress on the floor and her quiet sacrifices. Sophia walked into work that day like any other, unaware of the seismic shifts happening behind the scenes. But then her manager pulled her aside and handed her an envelope. Inside was more than just a raise, it was hope. Enough to move her family out of the trailer and into an apartment. Enough to let her eat without guilt. Enough to give her the security she had been fighting so hard to provide for her loved ones. For the first time in what felt like forever, she didn't have to pretend everything was okay when it wasn't. Michael had arrived at the office that morning as a CEO, a figurehead focused on profits, growth, and corporate success. But he left as something far greater, a leader. Someone willing to look beyond spreadsheets and boardroom meetings to see the human beings keeping the company alive. How many people around us are struggling in silence? How often do we look the other way because it's easier than confronting uncomfortable truths? If you have the power to help, even in the smallest way, don't wait. Do something today, because sometimes, all it takes is one moment of noticing to change everything, for yourself, for someone else, and for the world around you.